Okay, so I'd like to start by saying thank you to the Q Fund, who partly funded this research. I'm going to be talking about 18th century Cornwall, about slavery, the slave trade and abolition. When Britain was a maritime kingdom, Cornwall was not at the periphery. It was a maritime as well as a mining economy which traded with Iberia. Some historians estimate that as much as a third of Britain's trade with southern Europe was via Cornwall. Cornwall traded with the Dutch Republic, including tin exports to the Dutch Republic. It traded with colonial America and the West Indies and was involved in the 17th century tobacco trade. It also conducted inland coastal shipping. Ports in Cornwall serviced ships from the Dutch Republic and from colonial America. Ships from London sometimes stopped at Falmouth on outward or return journeys, and merchant and naval ships were sometimes paid off at Falmouth. When we look at the transatlantic slave trade, it was a triangular trade. Ships sailed from Europe to Africa with manufactured goods, from Africa to the Americas with enslaved Africans, and from the Americas to Europe with plantations produce, sugar, cotton and tobacco. And although it's the case that only one mid-17th century transatlantic slave trade actually from Britain departed initially from Falmouth, many transatlantic slave trade ships actually called at Falmouth and were serviced there. The Royal African Company retained an agent at Falmouth. Some returning transatlantic slave trade ships ended their voyages at Falmouth and paid off the crew there. As the trade and the colonies developed, the packet ships which maintained communication with the West Indies sailed from Falmouth, and even the Lisbon packets to Portugal carried gold bullion which had been mined by slaves. What this meant was that the community in Cornwall were well aware of the trade, and I think that affected the way that the abolition movement developed in Cornwall. There were Cornish families who profited directly from slavery and the slave trade. There were West Indies plantation owners in 18th century Cornwall, including the Longs of Trudadwell, the Molesworths of Pencarrow, the Prices of Penzance and Tranquinton, and the Trelawneys of Trelawn. There were Cornish landowners who made financially advantageous marriages to heiresses of fortunes which were derived partly from the slave trade. So families like the Bullers, the Elliots and Truss's family had some connections with fortunes which had been made partly through the slave trade and plantations. There were Cornish merchants, mariners, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, colonial administrators, politicians, who all derived some income from the slave trade and plantations that were worked by enslaved Africans. Plantation owners' wills sometimes listed enslaved Africans by name. So Rose Price's will, for example, which was proved in 1834, actually listed the enslaved people who worked plantations that he owned in Jamaica. Worthy Park in Jamaica was owned by the Price family, 3 generations of which lived at Penzance in the 18th century. There were some enslaved Africans who travelled to Cornwall. The 1700s probate of Thomas Corker shows that when he returned to Falmouth after working as a Royal African Company factor in Africa, he came with a household which included enslaved Africans, and when he died, those enslaved Africans were transferred at Falmouth to other individuals. What this does actually illustrate is that if you look at the information from the 1700 probate of Thomas Corker, 2 of the enslaved Africans, Martin and Jacob, went to sea captains and two of the enslaved Africans, Adam and Domingo, went to the household of Robert Corker, who was a merchant at Falmouth. The probate was administrated by Jane Corker, who was Thomas Corker's mother, and she also had an African servant who was christened at Falmouth, so somebody she probably employed as a servant, and who was not in the long term enslaved. And there are other examples from parish records in Cornwall of Africans who were regarded as the property of a person in Cornwall. So Mrs. Anne Chapman, for example, of Foy, who had previously lived in Antigua, was associated with the baptism of Samuel Chapman and Rachel Chapman, both of whom are described in the parish register as the property of Mrs. Anne Chapman. In 1761, Quakers proscribed any participation by Quakers in the slave trade. At Falmouth, George Croker Fox was a shipping agent, and other members of the family had a ship's chandlers, which operated from a shop at the bottom of Market Strand. In 1782, George Croker Fox organised some of the early petitions against slave trade and slavery from the towns of Falmouth, Penryn and Helston. And those were petitions to Parliament by the borough corporations calling for abolition of the slave trade. There were other people in Cornwall who came forward to join the abolition campaign. In total, 10 members of the Fox family actually subscribed to the National Abolition Campaign, including 5 women. That included the 2 sisters who ran the ship's chandlers in Falmouth. And there were 2 Cornish poets who wrote poems calling for abolition. Catherine Phillips was a Quaker minister who had travelled in colonial America. She met enslaved Africans and talked to them about their experiences. Her stepson was James Phillips, who was from Redruth. He was the son of a copper agent, but he was the secretary of the National Campaign for Abolition. And in 1794, Catherine Phillips published a poem called The Happy King, which called on George III to support the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. The Mines captain Richard Williams was a Methodist lay preacher who corresponded with Wesley. He spent some time in Falmouth in the 1780s, where it's possible that he met Thomas Clarkson. And in 1791 at Falmouth, he published his satirical poem on slavery. Olaudah Equiano in 1755 arrived in Britain for the first time in Falmouth, and his narrative was widely read and encouraged many people to support the campaign for abolition. And we know that, for example, his narrative was purchased and read by members of the Penzance Ladies Book Club. So there were people in Cornwall not directly associated with the trade who were beginning to come forward to support abolition. By 1792, newspapers reported that 12,000 people in Cornwall were supporting the West Indian sugar boycott. And that's actually, although many people would say that abolition was led by Quakers and Methodists, but if it was the case that 12,000 people were supporting the boycott, that was not only Quakers and Methodists, that's actually more than the total number of Quakers and Methodists in Cornwall at the time. Many people at many different levels of society were said to be supporting the campaign for abolition by boycotting West Indian sugar. That didn't mean that merchants and other people in Cornwall ended their participation in trade with the West Indies and colonial America. I've got one example here of Thomas Branwell of Penzance, who was the grandfather of the Bronte sisters, he actually part-owned a ship called the Nancy and Betsy, which completed a return voyage to the West Indies in 1792. It's possible that that was actually the ship that Rose Price travelled on to get to Jamaica, where he stayed for 3 years in the 1790s. And as Rose Price actually, while he was in Jamaica, had a relationship with an African woman who he manumitted, it's also possible that through Thomas Branwell and the association with Penzance, Rose Price's actions in having a family with a woman in Jamaica before he married his wife in England was one of the stories that Charlotte Bronte heard before she wrote Jane Eyre, which includes the early West Indian marriage of Mr. Rochester. As the abolition campaign developed, Cornwall's MPs were divided. It's just two examples here. On the young man on the far right of the painting by Zoffany was William Young, who was the MP for St. Mawes. His family owned plantations in the West Indies, and he was an opponent in Parliament of abolition of the slave trade. And in 1807, after the slave trade was abolished, William Young was appointed as governor of Tobago and continued to be associated with plantations worked by enslaved Africans in the West Indies. On the left-hand side of the screen, the portrait of Hussey Vivian shows someone who, after he returned from the Battle of Waterloo, was an MP who supported abolition of slavery in 1833. And with the help of Jane Wackett of the Royal Cornwall Museum, she actually identified the black hussar in the painting as probably William Affleck, who was a soldier in 10th Hussars and a trumpeter. But Hussey Vivian is remembered today not only because of his participation in the Battle of Waterloo, but because of his participation as a Cornish MP who supported abolition of the slave trade.